This is the Real Coaching Podcast. I'm Joel Filio, back with Paulo Souza.
Hi, Joel. How are you?
Not bad, not bad. Focused on planning for next year, and maybe we're planning for sprint triathlons. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's been a long time coming, and finally, people are talking about it. So it looks like it's going to happen.
So what are we talking about? We're talking about there was some news that's come out. I mean, it's partly news and part not really news. So we're talking about the ITU World Series, the Olympic Games, perhaps other games. Talking about changing from Olympic distance, as it were. I don't know whether we can, if this changes, are we going to still call it Olympic distance or what? But changing from a full distance, standard distance triathlon to a sprint. And so the president of the ITU, Marisol Casado, was at the British Triathlon Awards banquet on the weekend, and she was interviewed, and there was a couple of interviews that came out, which we'll link to, with some quotes about the future of triathlon, and really talking about Tokyo 2020, about changing to a sprint and the relay. With the quote was about, if we're going to get another triathlon event into Tokyo, then the best chance is if it's the same athletes that can race both. So we're not increasing the numbers, but it'll be a sprint distance and a mix, because it's easier probably to do both. I assume that's the rationale. They didn't exactly say that's the reason why. But then they did reference, though, this old canard about better television, which I'm not really sure is a good reason to change the sport, because I think even at the best of times, I think, even then, the whole media market is changing. Do we really need to appeal for what mass media market, or what average Joe sitting on the sofa is going to sit through an hour triathlon versus a 2-hour triathlon anyway?
Well, I would disagree with you there. I think that races, shorter races, are going to be more interesting. I think that with sprint distance keeps things more interesting. It's not just about the 1 hour event. For example, watching a 1 hour running event might be boring. Watching a triathlon where there's going to be a major event with during the race with transitions, and then the deciding part of the race. So I think that sprint distance would increase the level of interest throughout the event, and I said that finally people are talking about it, because I'm sure that you sensed, and I sensed, that this shift that towards having more and more sprint races, and also thinking that sprint races are the more interesting races most of the times that we have, and Olympic distance races, particularly like races where things get really boring towards the end of the bike, are not bringing a lot in terms of like excitement for the viewer. So I've throughout the years, I've grown more. I'm warmer to the idea of having sprint distance in the Olympics, and at the same time, I think that the mixed relay has a lot going for it, and this might be a way to sell it to the IOC, where you say, okay, we're saving 2 hours of TV on both the women's and the men's event, and we get an event in that more countries can win, that is more interesting in terms of spectator sport, and so ends up that triathlon is going to be less time on TV with more interest, and with the same number of athletes. So I think that's pretty interesting.
I mean, certainly I think everyone is supportive of the mixed relay. I mean, it's a great event. It's unique, being men and women together. It has some perhaps impact on selection and qualification, and if it's going to be the same athletes, but the inclusion, I think nobody would argue against. as say great television, you get cheering for your countries, etc. The argument sort of against the going to the sprint, I mean, the for argument, I think we've articulated, television is part of it, but also just a more dynamic, exciting race. However, the alternative or the other viewpoint was illustrated by Alistair Brownlee's quote in one of these interviews in the Times, which was one of the great things about triathlon. It's a really hard event that pushes you to your absolute limit, and that the full distance is kind of the true test, and the sprint race takes that really tough endurance element out. And then I read another comment today from another athlete who was basically saying, when are they going to make the marathon into a half marathon? So there's certainly that sentiment of changing the sport and losing something.
Mm-hmm. Well, yes and no, because I also believe that triathlon has always been a more flexible sport, a sport that's more open to changes and so it's not. I think one of the strengths of triathlon is that newness, more flexible, quote unquote younger kind of sport, and it's not like the triathlon has that, or Olympic distance triathlon has that tradition of somebody ran from one place to another in Greece and that's how we got the marathon. I don't think that we have that weight of tradition over the Olympic distance. It was just an exercise of, let's take the longest swim, let's take the classic 40K time trial, and let's take a 10K run, but I think we're past that and changing into something that's more exciting and that and also more accessible, because if we reduce the distances, people sitting on the couch will say like, hey, I can do that, I can get involved with this sport, and I think that we can all as a sport profit from that.
Of course, we already have plenty of sprint races that exist, but, talking about the very elite end of the sport, again, it's thinking about, I think the tradition part is interesting that you raised, because I think it's one of the problems with triathlon is we don't have a strong tradition. We're missing sort of the classics. So and I think there's a danger of losing some of that here. And I also think once you change the sport to go shorter, then you're not ever going back in terms of the games. And we even see this, I think, with the proliferation of sprint distance in the World Series, and they don't typically go back once organizers know that they can run a half distance event, and maybe it's cheaper, the road closures, there's all sorts of reasons why. And yes, it might be better for spectating, but we're not going back. So I'm kind of mixed on it, really. Like, I mean, fundamentally, the best athletes will still win, although there's some dynamics that are different. And it might be interesting to talk about that from a race dynamic, but also from a training dynamic, in thinking about how does this change how do we prepare? Does it change how we prepare? Some people might argue that it does, and others doesn't. When I think of the sprint world champs, when we had one, or just a sprint World Series race, I think more or less the top athletes are the same, but certainly the gaps are very much smaller. And where say you've got a small breakaway in a sprint, the kind of the quote unquote worst runners in that group can still salvage a good finish, even with a small gap, where in an Olympic race, they lose proportionally more time. And the other side of that would be this shorter swim can make a big difference in how the groups either come together or don't, because that smaller time difference can be enough that the groups, if you think of the classic men's dynamic of the last couple of years of the driving breakaway group and the chase pack, if you like, it seems like the sprint race is easier for the chase pack to close that down. They get closer to it. They get a sniff of it. You can see the back of the breakaway around, from corners, etc. You get closer to it. So what do you see? How do you see the dynamic changing, if at all?
Well, I think that with sprint distance, more people are competitive than with Olympic distance. So basically, the gaps are going to be smaller. The racing is going to be closer. It's probably not going to change. It's probably not going to change who's winning the races or who are the top athletes. But definitely more things can go wrong. Mistakes are maximized. For example, a mistake in transition might make or break your race, and a lot of times that doesn't happen with Olympic distance. So there's more uncertainty in the result, and the racing is faster. So I think it's all pluses to make racing more exciting. So I'm all on board with the change. I think one thing that I found interesting and is that even if there was always the expectation that we would move towards sprint distance at the Olympics in Tokyo, when the WTS calendar for next season came out, I was actually surprised that there weren't a lot of WTS races. There were sprint distance races, and at the time I remember thinking that, well, maybe the move is not going to happen. Maybe we're going to stay with Olympic distance. So it's interesting that we've had years where there were more sprint distance races on the WTS, and next season it's not exactly going to be like that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think from I was just thinking from a race point of view, exciting point of view. I think that the ITU's second most popular video on the YouTube site is from the London World Series, which was held over a sprint 2 years ago. The most popular is a motivational video, of course. That's what you would expect. 1.3 million views, which is the ITU's best motivational video of the year, and then second, 1.1 million views, the London finish of 2014. But yeah, back to there are finally as well from a training point of view, but talking about this calendar for next year, glad to see Abu Dhabi is back to a sprint, because racing so early, so in March, last year was over Olympic distance. This year, I mean, I don't know whether it fundamentally changes what you do, because you still got to think of the whole season. But when I saw that, I was pleased that it was a sprint, because I didn't want to feel like we really had to over prepare for the first race just because it was so early and it's an Olympic distance. So, it does perhaps change some dynamics of how often you can race, how you prepare, and how do you use these races.
I think it definitely does. I sometimes think that when we or me personally, when I'm thinking about training for ITU triathlon, I'm always thinking about the Olympic distance format, just because it's a format that rewards more raw fitness over technical prowess or skill. Even if we're still talking about triathlon, there's not a lot of skill involved. But I feel that the Olympic distance is more a test of raw fitness, and with sprint distance, there's a lot more. There's more tactics involved. There's more. It's more fast and furious. Less time to think. Patience is not rewarded as it is with Olympic distance, and from a training point of view, definitely we might have to, or I might have to switch the way I'm thinking to just faster racing, working on more the high end of training and less on the endurance part, because definitely when we hit, it's, I would say that like the difference between 1 hour total duration and 2 hour total duration is not trivial, and what we're going to have here is for example, like making the comparison with running, you you see, or with long distance running, you see that the half marathon is a lot closer to racing the 5K or the 10K than it is to racing the full marathon. So the same way, probably training for a sprint distance is going to be closer to training for a lot shorter durations than it is for the full 2 hours. So I think it's interesting. It's the new stuff. It's what's coming. So I'm ready to embrace it and make the necessary changes.
Yeah, and the other thing that, listening to you talk about that I think right now when we've got sprint races that are part of the World Series, everyone kind of knows that, well, the championships are full distance. So I don't know that anyone is specifically preparing for sprint races, where when this change happens, which I think we both believe is going to happen, then we might see things evolve a little bit. And as you say, we got to kind of think, well, what impact will that have? How will you need to change training? I mean, there's certainly, as you say, it allows more athletes to be competitive. And the other side to that is it's not as selective. And you were saying that, when you think about the 10K, running strong over 10K is really a differentiator between the best and the rest. And, the endurance required to do that, the fatigue resistance to not slow down, or have the fitness to use tactics, to go out hard and change pace, etc. It's selective. It's the same. We see the same discussions when, depending on it makes me think of the cycling world champs, either or various different tours when they announce the course of the Tour de France or another Grand Tour, and they talk about how the race can change based on how difficult it is, and it's what makes the classic special. These very long races that, if you raced 100K versus 250K, we know they're different races. They're both long, but they're different. And in triathlon, we might not expect drastically different tactics. There are still things to consider. And the fact that it's not as selective, meaning it may not sort of punish athletes that aren't conditioned as well, as much, for example, that I'm not so happy thinking about that, because I think what makes part of what leads to, success and a strong program is being better prepared than the rest. And, so when I think, oh, well, now the race is going to be less selective and, maybe a bit easier in some respects, then yeah, not so happy about that. On the other hand, there's an interesting challenge in front of us that, like, well, how do we adapt to this? Do you need to adapt? In what ways? And, I think there's an opportunity here, getting ahead of it, thinking about it, and how do you move forward with it? So, and equally also, when you're talking about another medal event potentially, then that's going to have an impact on programs, national programs, on funding. Doubling the medal events that we've got. That's could lead to more funding, and even how you select athletes. What are some athletes better over the mixed relay distance, which is even shorter than others? So, there's many factors to consider.
Yeah, but the question that I have for you now is, once the announcement is made and sprint distance is going to be in the Olympics, what's the point of doing Olympic distance or the longer distance at any time? What's the point of doing that?
That's a good question. In terms of I think the question is, what is the incentive to continue for organizers to continue to have Olympic distance? And will athletes then not do Olympic distance because why would you, as you say, the different event? I mean, I can still see using them, especially as part of the series. But I wonder then, is that going to be then the end of Olympic distance racing in the World Series?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we can announce the end of that distance in triathlon or in HIIT triathlon, just because there's not going to be just the incentive to train for it or compete at it. It's just not going to be, because what's maintaining right now the interest in in that distance. And the interest right now in sprint distance is that sprint distance is one step away from Olympic distance. But then if that mid step is not necessary, or if not created, then there's really no point in competing or training for Olympic distance. And you raised the issue of the race organizers a bunch of times, is that no race organizer wants to get stuck with a longer event, so you just like, why me? Why do I have to do it? And so maybe we'll just stay with WTS leads as the last Olympic distance WTS, and every other race switches to sprint distance.
Maybe. I mean, that's not gonna happen in 2017, but it could be the future. And then the other side of that is, are we going to see more mixed relays? Right now there's kind of one a year, or now we've got regional ones. So we've got the world champs plus the regional champs. But is that going to be a more frequent occurrence, stacking these two together in the same way? We'll see how that develops. So the article said that the ITU was going to announce this or expect in the first half of 2017. So we will see.
Yeah, and one another question that I have is how is selection for the mixed relays going to influence selection procedures for the Olympics? So if we were complaining on how complicated or how wrong some selection procedures are in some countries, then the added complexity of having to select athletes for the mixed relays is even bigger. You can think of I don't have to go too far, like a country like the US, where we have chances for medals in the women, but no chances for medals in the men. If we don't have a chance for a medal in the men in the individual race, are all athletes going to be selected in function of the mixed relay? So definitely it's going to bring another level of complexity to selection procedures. And I'm not going to lie, I'm not very optimistic regarding the ability of federations to get it right.
Yeah, I mean, that makes me think of, again, in cycling, in the games, if you wanted to, you couldn't just do the time trial, for example. You had to do the road race and the time trial. But there was clearly athletes who were just sort of going through the motions in the road race to sort of save themselves for the time trial. So, you could imagine, as you say, a situation like that, to somebody sort of, they've got to do both, so they sort of, half-ass the individual race because they've got to do both, or do you optimize for one or the other or both? I mean, it will be a new challenge, and we're not going to have a real good practice go at this because we do know we don't know, but the rumor is that the Commonwealth Games in 2018 is going to be a sprint and the relay. The last Commonwealth was an Olympic and the relay, so that might be kind of a half practice go for some countries at this kind of selection. But that doesn't necessarily require that the same athletes do both, because that wasn't the case in the Glasgow Commonwealth Games of 2014. So we'll see how they handle that. But then, as you said, the other part of it is how does the ITU or IOC ensure that there's enough teams? So every country's got to have obviously 2 men and 2 women. However, in the current system, there's only a limited number of countries that will have that, and it's subject to individual qualifications. So, there are some countries that might have 2 men but only 1 woman, and vice versa, or 2 of one and none of the other, etc. So how are we going to ensure that there's enough teams? So that's a whole other dynamic. And there was already talk of the ITU changing the number of countries that could qualify a maximum of 3 places. So currently, what's that, 8? So that might go lower, which also has the impact of lowering the depth of the individual race. If you go from 8 countries with 3 to 5, then you've removed a certain number of really top ranked athletes, haven't you? So moving on to a more topical this time of the year type thing. It does follow on of preparation to the next season, but it's lab testing silly season, Paulo.
Yes, it's here and it's in full-fledged and it's glorious on social media, Joel.
So what we're talking about is this time of year, we see a lot of athletes undergoing lab testing, undergoing performance testing. They're on treadmills. They're on bicycles with power meters, watt bikes or whatnot, or ergometers. All doing this sort of thing, and we sort of poke fun at it being silly season because it does contrast approach pretty differently with at least my personal practice and long experience with this sort of stuff. Really, the often cases, it's not that useful information that you get. And I think a lot of more experienced athletes are not interested in it at all. It's often kind of the younger athletes that are subjected to it. And really asking ourselves, what's the point of testing, performance testing when you've just come out of your off season, when you've been, hopefully, if you've done a good job in your program as a coach, then the athlete's had a proper rest, and therefore is lost conditioning. So I don't really see the point of it. And, most of my athletes from their federations don't have to do it. Some of them have to do something. And I rarely ever get any of the information that is produced from this. So I don't see the point of it.
Yeah, every year, and our most loyal listeners might remember that we talked about this last year. But every year, what you see is athletes take a break, and then when they resume training, they get tested, and everybody's very happy because a lot of the times when you get tested, you go to a lab and you get some gear strapped on and some data is collected, and everything looks very scientific-y. And what you do is you repeat the test a few months from now, and obviously because the athletes were in pretty bad shape or not close to their top shape, they got one set of results, and then a few months from now, because they will be training, they have improved, and everybody's really happy because we have data that training works, and obviously, a bunch of times, or 90% of the times, or 95% of the times, and this is a made up stat right here. Nothing from this process of testing is going to impact the training process throughout the year. And even if people come out and say like, oh, but I am different, what I'm doing is different, is just like pump the brakes, because what's going to happen is the distance between exercise physiology testing and performance and training, it's still really big across the board. And it's really big across the board. Why? Because throughout the years, training like this or doing procedures like this hasn't been shown to be significantly better than not doing them. So why are we still doing them? And we embark in processes where you have a lot of people around you that are telling the athletes and coaches is, hey, I don't speak your language, and I'm not going to be bothered with speaking your language. So you have to speak my language, and you have to come into my arena and show me what you're doing, when this is completely a completely useless process. So you see that this process gets repeated on and on and on again without any impact in your process, except for feeling good that you're doing something that looks a little bit like science, but in fact, it's nothing like science.
Well, and it's pseudoscience, really, isn't it? I mean, that's a problem with a lot of sports science, and we did a whole episode on this, but it's really another of our evergreen topics, because again, it's like, what is the utility of this? How does this integrate with what you're doing? And if the answer, it doesn't really integrate, if it's just, doing it because you think you should be doing it, or doing it to sort of appear sophisticated, or appear as what you think a high performance program should be, then those aren't good reasons. And the issue that I often have it in a most practical level is many athletes don't like doing them, particularly experienced senior athletes. In my experience, they don't like doing them at all, and because they don't need a lab test to demonstrate to them that they're out of shape, and we're not really interested in whether their base condition changes that much year to year. I mean, it's entirely context dependent. How much time did they have off this year? This is the end of the quad. Maybe some athletes have had longer time off, and therefore their basic condition might have degraded a little bit more. Who cares? It's not important. What's important is their peak condition, not their base condition. And as you said, it comes back to, how does it change the process? Does it give us any meaningful information? And this is the question, that if you can't answer that, then don't do them. And we don't want to do them just to sort of data mine. And that's another thing that I've seen over time, is we're doing these tests to collect information about the athletes, not to help the athletes get better. And I don't agree with that at all. And it kind of perhaps rolls into a nice quote that I saw by a gold medal winning coach, Tony Minichiello, who's the decathlon coach or heptathlon coach of Jessica Ennis in the US. And this all really kind of blends together. And in his quote on Twitter, which we'll link to, is that coaches in the UK have been marginalized in funded sports. Medics science leads and takes no accountability if it fails. And that really resonated with me. That's kind of my experience. And I've talked a lot about the sort of the sports science, sports medicine lobby being very strong, just meaning that the ability to gather resources and importance, if you like, in the funded model has really increased in the last years. And given the typical sort of fixed resources that are available to sports, and the place of coaches have been marginalized or have been reduced as a result. But this isn't the best model, and I think at the core of it, everybody knows it's not the best model, and yet this is the direction that many sports organizations are going.
Yeah, sports science. The role that it has is that it checks a box, and the box is we're doing things right, the right way, and that's really important for funding agencies, that their primary concern is that they're funding processes that are doing the right thing. Nobody wants to say like that, to say like, okay, we're going to fund this athlete and that coach because we think that they're going to be doing a good job. Doesn't check enough boxes there. So we need to have a check box for the exercise physiologist, and we need to have a check box for the strength and conditioning coach, and we have to have a check box, which is we have putting in place the infrastructure justifies the funding in a better way than just saying like, oh, we gave the money to this athlete and this coach. That's just simply not acceptable from an organizational point of view, when we know, and this is not just our view. What we see constantly is the triumph of coaching and athletes in the world arena against programs that are heavily into sports science and heavily into the IST and less on the coach-driven, athlete-centered approach. And these programs are time and time again defeated in the arena, in the world arena. So what needs to change here? What needs to change here is go back to what works, which is cultivating good professionals, good coaching professionals, good athlete professionals, delivering results. That's what needs to be supported. Obviously, what happens here is funding agencies get really nervous when they just give money to somebody thinking like, oh, we think that these people are going to do a good job.
And Wayne Goldsmith, who's an Australian coach educator who's been involved in triathlon and swimming, he had a good comment when I posted this on Facebook, and I'll read some of it because it follows on what you've just said. And with regards to Tony's quote about coaches being marginalized, he says, agree completely. Sports science is a tool for intelligent, committed coaches and athletes to use if and when appropriate. It, meaning sports science, has overpromised and under-delivered for the past 10 years. Really, and then he goes on to say, sports scientists want the fame and association with the stars, but accept zero accountability for the athlete's performance. And that's something that Tony comments on, and I'll elaborate on it in a moment. But he says, I see this all over the world. Silly science driven by conservative government sports funding agencies still embracing the ridiculous single discipline department model of service delivery and promoting the ludicrous evidence-based practice philosophy, while the real world moves towards integrated cross-disciplinary practice-based evidence. And there's a couple things on there, and we've been critical, and I think we've got it in our notes to do a takedown on this evidence-based BS. And I like what Wayne says here about practice-based evidence, and practice and implementation is everything, and that ought to lead the way. And if there's a way that coaching is going wrong, it's to get drawn into this failed model or this department model, as Wayne says, which just doesn't work. But there's just such a push towards that. And the other side of it is the accountability part. And again, we've talked about this, and it's something we're believers in, of the accountability of working with an athlete, and there's a directness there, and when you have integration, then everyone involved can be accountable. When you've got this sort of plug and play service model or IST model without the I, the integrated support team, but it's not often integrated. And there may be many reasons why, such as not having the budget to integrate it. I mean, I see this all the time. It's, hey, we've got this physiologist that's working with us, but we only have the budget for a couple of hours a month. And it's like, well, that's not going to be very useful, is it? That's not integrated at all. Or often with medical support, it's the same. It's like you've got a physiotherapist or a medical practitioner. You'd like them to come out and look at training. You'd like them to do all sorts of stuff, but don't have the budget to do that. Not really that integrated then. And it's difficult to be accountable in that way. And, I see this, this is going on right now. Some of the athletes that I work with are being asked to do this sort of testing and analysis. And it falls down because, first of all, there's no effort to integrate it at all. And athletes often see it quite negatively in the sense that it's used as a criticism of the athlete instead of using it to try to help them. And it's easy to throw a bunch of information at the athlete and then walk away. And that's just not that helpful.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And the deal here is that a lot of people coming from the sports science field a lot of the times interact with these problems not by trying to do their job or try to provide a service that's going to be different and actually helpful, but it's going to be more on the side of like, well, you're a caveman, you don't understand what we do, you're not open, you're old school, and it's not about that at all. It's about providing value and providing added value to what coaches and the athletes are doing. And a lot of the times what sports science comes in is they provide added complexity, they provide added stress to the process, and that doesn't come with increase in performance and with better processes that are going to come from that. One thing that was interesting, one thing that we were following, both of us, and we talked about that before, about how for rowing in New Zealand, how they had a sports science centered approach for Rio, and they ended up failing, and basically athletes that were doing better they were doing well before, kept doing well because they kept most of their process intact. Athletes that were doing well, that changed their process completely, went on to not doing well, and the results were very dismal. And I think that ended up with a lot of the people in charge of the program going on to do better jobs, hopefully. So every day, every year, we see approaches that are sports science and that are failing. And one thing that I think one of the good things that comes out from the Team Sky debacle is that they seem to be very sports science centered, and the marginal gains were all sports science based, or seemingly, but turns out that it was good old drugs in charge of the superiority of their program.
I mean, that's out of the Armstrong playbook. No, we've talked about that before, but appearing sophisticated when it's very old school in another way, perhaps going on in the background. And I know there's an interesting upcoming book that probably won't be in English, but cyclist Thomas Dekker. I saw this on Twitter, and it looks like a proper tell-all book about what was going on in Rabobank in the late 2000s, and with Michael Rasmussen, who's quite outspoken about it as well. And then the old doctor from Rabobank ended up at Team Sky. So that's unfortunate. As we've talked about before, either horrible judgment or very good judgment, depending on your point of view on things. But I mean, that rolls into just, summarizing, we've talked about this loads, but coaching as art or science, and of course we're not Luddites here. This is not the approach we're talking about. It's about how do you integrate information, how do you use advances, but in a practice-based evidence way, meaning that you I know you've integrated this, and I've done as well. When you have a kind of intervention that you think might have some benefit, and you go out and put it in the field, and you look at it, and the evidence comes from the observations and data you collect in the field. It's not coming from the lab, as it were, in those kind of conditions. So good coaching able to use this information to help you make better decisions. And this was I tweeted an article about this, but that had parts of this. What's the secret of the world's best paid sports manager? Asked the Chicago Cubs, which is a little bit of the old take whatever the winning team is and look at what they're doing as best practice, which is not always the case. As we know, there's some things that winning teams are doing that are not the cause of why they're winning. It may, and in fact, the first part of this article was really a lot of touchy-feely stuff about mindfulness and all of this, but later it got to some really good stuff, which is about coaching is about decision making and using information to make better decisions. And the winning team or winning athletes and coaches are making better decisions daily, in my view. And that's in fact what a lot of coaching is. And this is why, we often call it coaching practice. You're practicing making decisions, because when you're on deck, when you're engaged in real coaching, you're making many of the decisions every day, and you stack those weeks and months and years together, and you get better over time. And that's, the core of, how do you navigate this process? Not just about physiological knowledge, not just about collecting more data. It's how do you use that to make better decisions?
Yeah, I would agree completely. Decision making, that's what coaching is about, because a lot of the times it's not about what we're doing specifically, but what we decide that we're going to be doing. It's making the decision of doing something or not doing something. It's how we deal with the unexpected. That's what coaching is about. I was reading someplace, and hopefully I can remember it and we can put it in the show notes. But that it's not about the plan. It's about the process. And a lot of the times, and picking up on what we were talking about sports science, a lot of the times what we get from sports science, it's a lot about the plan. For example, you're reading on a paper that these athletes were doing this session for 8 weeks straight. A lot of the times, if it's about the plan, then the impetus, the desire that we want to stay with a plan and do that session for 8 weeks straight is going to be higher than just listening to the athlete and thinking like, oh, maybe we shouldn't do it today because of this reason or that reason, or because it doesn't fit what the context that we have right now. So making little decisions on the day to day is what's going to determine how successful you are. It's not about what the sessions are or how much we're going to do. Is how we can adjust and also obviously maintain our vision intact, maintain the direction towards what we want to accomplish. But decision making, the small decisions, the large decisions, owning those decisions and having the athlete own those decisions, those are going to be the fundamental aspects of what coaching is about.
Yeah, and to think, bring it to a practical level, when we're talking about decision making, it's as simple things that we do all the time. Is the athletes looking like they're a little bit ill, or they've got a niggle or a pain? What do you do about that? Do you continue the program as planned? Do you adjust? If you adjust, how do you adjust? How do you talk about that? How do you communicate those things? The way that you communicate them. All those are multiple layers of decisions that we make all the time, and we have to make all the time. The easy thing, I suppose, would be to not make a decision and just to plow on with what you plan, but rarely is that the right one. But so how do you get better at knowing what the right decision is, and how do you make those changes? And, this happens at all levels. It doesn't have to be because the athlete is ill or injured, but, if a race doesn't go as planned, how do you handle that? What decisions do you make? Do you rush to make changes? Do you hold the line and keep moving forward? When we're talking about process, it's identifying areas to improve. How do you navigate that process of improving? Because it doesn't happen linearly. So, do you just chop and change, or do you continue with the bigger picture and philosophy? So it's integrated in everything we're doing. And I think if there's one thing that, real coaching is about, it's about getting better and better at that.
One thing that's pretty big for me is to, and this is something that I interact with my athletes and sometimes tell them about, is let's not validate our decisions based on the outcome, because we as humans have a tendency to judge a decision by the outcome that we have, and a lot of the time, I see it all the time, and you see it all the time. Bad decisions that result in a good outcome. For example, athlete A should not be doing this race because of the stage of their development, where they are, where it's in the season, all that. They shouldn't be doing this race. Athlete goes to do the race and performs extremely well, does not validate the decision that that was taken. So basically, step away from the binary thought of a good outcome validates the decision, but more, was it a good decision? Was it a good decision? Because a lot of times you might have good decisions that are going to have a bad outcome. So not tie down athlete, and this is important for how athletes perceive things and how much they own their decisions is okay. What with the information that we had beforehand, we made a decision. We're going to be committed to this decision. This doesn't mean that the outcome is going to be positive, but with all the information that we had, we made a decision. And a lot of times, from the other side is the people that interact with us. You have to, teach them or educate them towards, hey, just because we failed doesn't mean that we didn't make a good decision. And obviously we can have scenarios where we make a bad decision and that turns into a bad outcome, and it's going to be pretty evident for everyone why it was a bad decision. But we need to step away from that binary thinking of bad outcome means bad decision, good outcome means good decision.
And the other part that resonates with what you just said is short-term versus long-term, because we can have a totally different perspective when we, and this is what we need to try to do as coaches, is to have that, 30,000 foot view or whatever analogy you want to use, but the long-term view, because it's very easy to rationalize poor decisions in the short term that might lead to what looks like a reasonable outcome, that might be very poor decisions in the long term. And the example you use about athletes racing, and we've talked about development in this podcast, is an excellent one, because often young athletes who are very talented, it looks like they're quote unquote ready for a certain level of competition, and they might even get away with it. But it's, what are you compromising in the long term in order to do that? And that's the classic junior burnout story that just nobody seems to learn from, or not enough of us seem to learn from that process. And there's a huge body of work out there of bad decisions that we can refer back to, but you've got to become a student of your sport and of people if you're going to really take that forward. So short term versus long term as well. Another one, which is very much related to this, is moving into some follow-up about decision making, about decisions about training. And we had a nice question about high load training camps. And it's something that's fairly common amongst age group athletes or working athletes who've got some time to dedicate to training. Maybe they got a holiday and they're going to go away, and what are they going to do with that time? And the classic one that a lot of athletes think about doing, and a lot of them do. And I remember back in the day, I don't know if this is still a thing, but these epic camps. Do you remember epic camps, Polo?
Oh, I remember epic camps. Remember epic camps? That was fun to watch.
Basically treating a training camp like a competition in terms of the goal is to survive it or complete it. But of course, in the big picture, where do these camps fit in your program? And, we hammer away at the principles of consistency and progression. And so jumping into a high load camp, perhaps conflicts with that. So I'll, get to the question, because I've not actually read the question, but the notion of high load training camps where the workload is really pushed for a week has always interested me. A lot of athletes respond well to this stimulus. I'm thinking, proposed hard week, easy week approach could be quite similar. Question is how hard and how easy those weeks should be. And, will I respond to this, basically? So what's your take on that? What do you think? Is it worthwhile? Is there some value here?
First off, I would make the distinction between age group and elite athletes. from my perspective, and when it comes to elite athletes, I've certainly been stepping away from the concept of high load training camps. But I'm sure that when my athletes are listening to this, they're going to go like, "What? No, there's no way." But definitely that's that the way of seeing camps, like for example, like altitude camp or a camp that you go for a particular location to just train incredibly hard. I've definitely stepped away from that concept and looking for and looked for some more sustainable ways of planning training. In terms of age group athletes, it's a situation where any age group athlete can increase their training load for a short amount of time, but that short amount of time is not very sustainable. So I don't see anything wrong with athletes that are doing training camps. They just live in the cold climates, riding the trainer all the time. If in February or March they go to a warm place to train, I think that there's many benefits of that. The impact that's going to have in their overall fitness, it's probably going to be dependent on how close they do these camps to their target races. But there's plenty of benefits from a mental point of view and just a change of scenery and all that. I think that one thing that you didn't mention regarding this question, it was more our listener was in a situation where he had basically a job that was 1 week on, 1 week off, where he was able to train unlimitedly for a week and then very constrained for another week. And this is a situation where I can see a total explosion if you go really hard on those on weeks, just because it seems that, like, and that's my experience, I'm sure that's your experience, most athletes, either age group or elite, they respond well to very little changes in training load. So basically, gradual increases or gradual decreases in training load are going to be more effective in building fitness than just the shock recovery way of planning training. So definitely for this listener that has this sort of work, and a lot of people end up having schedules like this, or people that work in shifts or that kind of those kinds of jobs. I would think that the more sustainable they can make their process, the more they can train when they're working, and also when they're when just equalizing loads between when they're working and when they're not working. I think that's a more sustainable way of training than just going for really big weeks followed for big recovery weeks. That's most of the time that's not going to be a very sustainable way of training.
So we're coming back to consistency, progression over time. So one of the questions here is, what makes a good camp versus a bad one? And I would say a bad training camp is one where you're ill or injured or just totally wrecked afterwards, and that impacts the following weeks too much. So if you train so hard that the following weeks have to be reduced, that's too much. The elite approach with this that we've talked a lot about is, if you're going to increase the volume of training that you're doing, don't increase the intensity of training or even decrease the intensity. So if you're coming from the cold, dark winter and you're going to Arizona, California, the Canary Islands, southern Spain, wherever, and you want to ride more, then by all means, but it ought to be a lot of easy riding and not chucking in a bunch of high intensity stuff, just because then you're going to throw the workload balance completely out. And I think what you're saying there about consistency over time with, shift cycles. I've coached athletes who were firefighters, who were on police shifts, and they end up with a variable schedule, but we try to find a pattern out of that, of what's sustainable, repeatable workload over time that allows them to see progression, as opposed to getting a big whack in a week camp and then being wrecked after.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree completely.
So the next question we had is from a listener called Remy. And what do you do when an athlete's got an acute but mild disease like sore throats, bronchitis? So acute but mild is interesting. I mean, it really just means, makes me think of, what do you do when an athlete's got a cold? It's cold season now in the Northern Hemisphere. Things go around. How do you handle it? What do you do?
Yeah, I feel I empathize with Remy because English is also hard for me. Obviously, acute is the opposite of mild, so basically, I think what the question is what do you do? Like, what kind of symptoms do you train through? What kind of symptoms you have to back off from training? And I think that actually. I read some research that validated the common advice that is given in these circumstances, which is if your symptoms are above your neck, then you can train through, and if your symptoms are below your neck, then you should take time off. Personally, the way I manage athletes is basically telling them that if they're congested, if their nose is congested, if they have a sore throat, then and if they're willing to train, they can do a range of between like very easy training to a full program, depending on how they feel and what they're capable of doing. And but if symptoms are definitely below the neck, and particularly like I'm always on the lookout for flu-like symptoms, which are general body aching or a fever, then it's an immediate day off. So this is what I tell my athletes, just like, hey, if you have body aching, if you have a fever, then there's no training through, there's no mild activity, there's not even like going for a walk. You just need to be home and getting as much rest and liquids as you can. As you know, like the dangers of exercising with a viral infection or with a bacteriological infection are really, really big. You can develop a heart condition coming out of exercising with a viral infection. So definitely always be on the lookout for viral symptoms, and that's like no compromise there. I always tell my athletes, just like automatic, the rest of the day is off. The next day is off at the end of the next day. Then we'll reevaluate. And most of the times, what happens is that if they're feeling they have flu-like symptoms one day, then the next day they're full on sick and they just cannot do anything, and kind of like validates our decision, but I'm pretty strict with that. I just want to make sure that nobody's training with viral symptoms, because that's going to be a big no.
Yeah, absolutely. Don't have anything to add to that. That's sensible. I mean, there's some athletes that have kind of general head colds that kind of panic a little bit, and it's like anything. It's how do you deal with it? Because you can add stress if you're worried about it. You can make it worse if you like. But But, research-wise, training through a mild head cold doesn't seem to make much difference in terms of recovery time. But as you say, anything, chest congestion, fever, body ache, viral symptoms, then that's a reason to respect and rest, rather than trying to train really at all.
Absolutely.
The next question from Remy was, and we've talked about this, and we could touch on it briefly. To what extent are the elite athlete way of training transferable to the average age grouper? So many age groupers sort of copy some stuff, and he references high cadence looking at pro cyclists, but is it meaningful? We've covered this to some degree. I think it's principle based, and the high cadence thing is a whole that's a whole ball of wax, isn't it? Because a lot of that was coming from the Armstrong years, and there's other reasons perhaps why. But what's your take on sort of the transferability of elite training to average age groupers?
Well, first off, Joel, if I tell that age groupers need to train in totally different ways from elite athletes, how am I going to sell my age group business? It's going to be very, very hard. This is just a little joke, just because a lot of the times you see coaches selling themselves or the way they coach as kind of like, hey, look, I'm coaching you just like the elite athletes that I have, and it's not exactly like that, I think that the biggest difference here, and taking away the differences in ability and genetic predisposition for endurance training, is that age group athletes have constraints in their life that don't allow them to have the same approach to the sport as elite athletes, and as such, everything about their approach needs to be different. Not in the way like, I would say that the principles are going to be pretty much the same because they're still endurance athletes, but definitely a lot of the approaches need to be different when talking about time constrained athletes, and I find it interesting that there's a lot of talk about polarized training when it comes to age group athletes, and one of the biggest factors that make polarized training successful is the volume of low intensity training that elite athletes are able to perform. So a lot of the times we like to think about how polarized training, the biggest source of success is going to come from the high intensity training that is associated with that kind of training. But I would say that the biggest source of success is going to be the kind of training that you're doing for most of the time, which should be the 80% of time. So basically, from that point of view, is polarized training a good approach for age group athletes? Probably not. So I would say that training strategies are going to have to be specifically targeted to age group athletes, and that's coaching. That's just coaching, which is, we have this athlete has this constraint. What are the things that are going to be working for them? And it's the same as in elite athletes. Their constraint is more from an ability level. They're not as good runners as they need to be. They're not as good swimmers as they need to be. They're not as good cyclists as they need to be. And those are constraints that we need to work about on the time of the age groupers. Their constraint is time and focus on what they're doing. I would say that the biggest difference that I see is that for age group athletes, you work your weaknesses, and for elite athletes, you work your strengths. So you can see here that kind of like divides the approaches enormously. Where in one hand, with age group athletes, most of the times they're going to have a big weakness that they need to work on to be able to access the next level of performance. With elite athletes, they are at a pretty high general level, and exploring their strengths is going to be the best chance that we have to elevate their performance.
Great. We'll move on to the next one, also from Remy, which is about our evergreen topic, I think, HIIT, high intensity. Are you a believer in several high intensity 1 week blocks alternating with low intensity weeks? And I think the answer is no. Would you agree?
There's an interesting paper. And I think what our listener here is talking about is maybe unknowingly is a bit of block periodization, where basically you load up on something and then just use it as maintenance. One of the papers, and if I find it, we can put it on the show notes. There's a paper. This is for cycling training, and what they used is a model where they had two groups. One group was doing for 4 weeks two sessions a week of interval training, and the other group was doing, in the first week they were doing 4 or 5 sessions. So basically every other day they were doing an intense session, and then the following week they were just doing a maintenance one time a week session. I've used this model a few times with I would say like confounding results. I think that it's not every athlete that is able to do the first week of really hard training, and that kind of wears them down and has a huge impact in the training process, and so a little bit not really impressed with the results that I had, so probably not going to be using it again. So I would say that not a big fan of that kind of periodization, or that block periodization way of planning training.
And just to elaborate on my no, it's similar to my view on the high-low training camps, in that my coaching practice is consistent progression over time and stability of loading. And I think the really high loading, while there is a short-term benefit, we can measure this. We see that's why this protocol is so popular now, because it's easy to see some improvement over the short term. But I'm interested in the long term, and how do we develop athletes that can perform at the right times and with consistency and predictability. And that's where I come back to just that progression, that stability of workload rather than a highly variable workload. Moving on, another question, and I think is an interesting one as well, and that's are you fighting to win seconds on transitions or equipment to save watts or aerodynamics, or is being the strongest the most important, and you spend 99% of your time chasing this? Initially, obviously, they're not mutually exclusive. Looking for areas to improve and gain time, if you like. On the other hand, if was forced to pick a side, then triathlon as an endurance sport values conditioning and more conditioning, and you never go wrong prioritizing that over over seconds on transition, etc. Of course, the context is everything that we're talking about. But even in elite sport, I mean, transition makes big difference in short distance racing, smaller difference in long distance racing. I mean, it's even watching some of the athletes in Kona lose 30 seconds in transition might not seem much, but if your tactic was to follow another athlete, then that might hurt. Chasing that down, I think we talked about with Kienle on some of that and the strategy. But in any case, I guess it's perspective, but I think the message that I would have is not mutually exclusive. You can look for improvements at the same time as keeping your focus on the 99%.
Yeah, this is a false opposition here, because we can definitely have both. We can focus on the marginal gains, and we can focus on the 99%. I think the critique that can be made is when we spend 99% of the time chasing the 1%, and then 1% of the time chasing the 99%, which means that we're going to not be paying attention to the biggest factors that are going to define performance. In the process that I follow with my athletes, what we try to do is try to cover as many bases as we can, but give them the necessary place, or just put things into their proper place. Like, for example, if we go to a race, it's not going to be like, most of the talk is not going to be about what tires and tubes and tire pressure we're going to be using. It's probably, that's going to be important, but it's not going to be as important as race tactics or general fitness on the day, and getting things right on the day. So to summarize, we can focus on everything, but we need to still put more of our focus on the things that are going to be the biggest deciders in for performance, and then put things like the marginal gains, the 1% things, then we can put them in their proper place, and not have them take over your whole focus.
Few questions on nutrition. We can move through these probably relatively quickly, shorter answers. But generally, are you, in your coaching practice, are you giving nutrition advice to your athletes?
Yes. By yes, I tell them to most athletes, particularly most elite athletes, are not eating enough, and most of the advice that I have for them is to eat enough, to make sure that they're getting in an environment where carbs, or in a society where carbs are evil. We still need these guys to eat a lot of carbs, because muscles are still loading up with glycogen, which is a carb, and there's still going to be carbs in your liver ready to be used in physical activity. So carbs are still going to be a pretty big thing. So remind athletes about the timing of nutrition, to eat more carbs. So basically, like general guidelines in nutrition. I do give them advice in terms of like being in charge of their whole nutritional plan. Then the answer is no.
I mean, and I suppose the question could be in the sense of like, do you have a nutritionist involved? And, that's perhaps in special circumstances. Not every coach has access to that. And it comes back to like, generalist versus specialist. But I think a competent coach has got to be able to have a good grasp on the essential nutrition aspects. And you mentioned an interesting point there about the evil carbs, because I find that's I see that more and more with the vilification of carbs, that there's all sorts of different athletes, even ones you wouldn't expect, that are either consciously or unconsciously restricting their fueling. And it's the quickest way to stunt progress recovery, even potentially become ill more often, is to not fuel yourself appropriately. And whereas if you weren't if you were just thinking casually about nutrition, I'm sure many people are thinking about losing weight or body composition. But I actually think your point about recovery and fueling is where the focus needs to be.
Yeah, and just as a warning, if you're listening to this and you belong to the church of low carb, high fat, don't even bother in contacting us. Okay, we will not reply to you. We will use your email or message as personal entertainment. So don't even bother.
So another one, do you plan sessions in the fasted state? So this is another pop science kind of theme, fasted training. And I mean, it's interesting if you do an analysis of triathlon training, particularly elite triathlon training with high frequency. Inevitably, some of the training is done in a at least partially fasted state, whether you know it or not. However, then there's the question of deliberate fasted training as a training strategy, presumably to have a high stimulus for alternative fuel burning or simply stress.
Mm-hmm. I use fasted state sessions sometimes with some athletes. Not everyone. I don't think it fits everyone, but I find them useful. I also one of the advantage of having a nerdy wife is that my wife actually knows what PGC 1 alpha and AMPK means, and she explained it to me. And I would say that like the science on fasted state training is pretty strong, and something that I am very on board with. But at the same time, going back to the theme of always looking for a sustainable process. This is definitely a subject where using too much fasted state training or using fasted state training with the athletes that are going to have trouble understanding the role that it's got in training. We're gonna end up with a process that's not gonna be sustainable, and we're gonna be crashing pretty soon. So definitely, I wouldn't say this is not something that like one size fits all. I think needs to be very careful. It's very careful. The application of these methods need to be very carefully applied, but they can be successful. But going back to what we were talking earlier, so many athletes, particularly elite athletes, it's a struggle for them to get enough calories in a day. It's a struggle for them to dial up their nutrition. So if I have an athlete like that, and I have many athletes like this, suggesting them fasted sessions is definitely not the way to go. With training. So this can be effective, but it's not for everyone, I'd say.
Agreed. Not for everyone, and it's a tool we can use, but there's other things that take priority in a lot of cases that are going to have a bigger impact, such as just being consistent over time. Supplements like beta alanine. Have you had athletes use beta alanine in preparation before?
No, I don't think I've ever, like, at least not from my end. Maybe I'm a little old school, but the list of supplements that work, the best source for that is WADA. WADA keeps a list. WADA keeps a list of supplements that work, and that's their prohibited supplements, prohibited the substance list that they put out every year. And by the way, just as a side note, that list for 2017 is out. And if you're, and I know that everyone listening to this, if they're a member of a federation, if they're a member of USAT, if they're a member of any federation, they're subject to both out of competition and in competition training. So make yourself familiar with the WADA list. But basically, this is a little bit of a joke, but basically the supplements that work are the ones that are prohibited, and there's not a lot of supplementation out there that's going to work that's not prohibited. Of course, stuff like beet juice or pretty much like beet juice is the biggest thing in my mind now. I would say that like beet juice is something that there's decent science showing that it might work with maybe with less trained athletes. So basically, it looks like beet juice works more for sedentary people or not people that are not that are recreational athletes. The papers on beet juice and the elite athletes show no benefits. So I'd say like if you want to think of a supplement that works, I would go with beet juice.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of those cases, effect is so, if there's a positive effect, it's so subtle not to be particularly noticeable, or it's placebo based, more so than a measurable effect, or perhaps lost in the noise even. So, yes, the WADA list, and age groupers can be tested too, as we see every once in a while from USADA. Just a couple of more quick ones. Do you advise protein intake to your athletes after some training sessions?
Yes, sometimes. Basically, I've been experimenting with some athletes doing a protein shake at night. There's some good science about that. So part of the strategy of increasing calorie intake or basically matching your calorie intake with your needs, I've been using some giving the advice of increasing protein intake at night.
And what about after? Well, you don't really have a high strength training group, but there's some that would suggest after strength training or particularly muscularly intensive training, they might benefit from a 20-gram protein intake.
Yeah.
And the last question, do you believe in high carbonated beverages after training might be useful? I'm not sure if that's really meant to be carbohydrate beverages after training, but as it says carbonated, we'll go with that.
Well, with carbonated, I would just say that after a long, hot ride, just drinking a cold Coke, don't you find that incredibly useful?
Very good for the brain.
Oh, yes, incredibly useful. I think our listener was probably talking about the recovery drinks, and I have some athletes that are sponsored by brands like by nutritional brands, and they have recovery shake. I would recommend that if you're sponsored, definitely take them, because they just put a lot of carbs and a lot of calories in you in a fast, practical way right after training. But they're probably as good as real food, and it's really easy for you to just finish a session and just do your own shake, a high carb shake, or you can eat real food, and the effects in recovery are going to be the same.
Absolutely. So it's as much convenience and packaging than it is necessarily any better, and that's a valid reason. But particularly a lot of these products, recovery products, etc., are quite expensive. So it's not I think it's good for people to realize it's not necessary, and that real food is good or even better than some of these recovery products. And whether they're useful or not. Of course, recovery nutrition is useful. We know that, but the form can be different. So a number of good questions. Thank you, Remy. And I think it was Jason that asked the question about high load training camps. So we'll wrap it there. Send us more comments and feedback. Send Paulo all of your high carb, low fat, or high fat, low carb to podcast at joefilia.com. We're on Stitcher and Google Play. Somebody tell us if you can find us on either. Make sure that's working. And otherwise, we'll talk to you next time.
Thanks, Joel.